This is the gray wolf or Canis lupus. In genetic studies, it has been proven that they are the closest relatives of domestic dogs throughout the world, although dogs have many breeds. However, it turns out they are descended from the same species, and in fact, they are the only large carnivores that has been domesticated by humans. Apart from that, dogs turned out to be the first animals to be domesticated. They lived with humans even when humans were still living as hunters and gatherers. Humans had a big influence on the evolution of dogs. Even if we talk about pets that are humans' best friends, dogs are the answer. But how can wolves, which are synonymous with wild animals, now become humans' friends? To see the beginning of dog domestication, we have to go to Eurasia around 30,000 years ago, at a time when humans still relied on living as hunters and gatherers. At that time, wolves who lived wild began to be attracted to camps made by humans. Initially, humans would chase away wolves that looked aggressive, but over time, the wolves that looked non-threatening were eventually left alone by humans. The arrival of wolves to the human-made camp is none other than the food factor. With a sense of smell 100 times better than humans, it is certainly easy for the wolves to detect food cooked by humans. Wolves then benefit from leftover food thrown away by humans. They no longer need to bother hunting. For thousands of years, they have followed humans wherever they go. During that time, wolves have gradually become more tolerant of humans. This eventually becomes humans' best friends, and during this time they slowly diverged from wild species. They were the beginning of today's domestic dogs.
They followed their noses to the edge of our camps and discovered an unexpected prize: our garbage.
This is a domestication mechanism known as the commensal pathway, where animals approach humans because they are attracted to leftover human food or prey that is also approaching humans. The explanation above is the one most commonly used to explain the beginning of the relationship between humans and dogs. The presence of wolves living around human camps initially did not have a beneficial impact on humans, but it was not detrimental either. This is what is called commensalism. However, over time, humans finally realized the benefits of wolves around them. Wolves can act as an alarm when there are wild animals or even other human tribes, as well as being able to guard against the presence of these wild animals. Of course, what they do is not to protect humans. This is just a natural instinct when danger threatens. But what these wolves do has indirectly protected and helped humans.
It's likely the camp wolf's earliest service to humans was as an alarm to danger. In protecting her own young, this camp wolf unintentionally protected the humans.
The closeness of wolves to humans has created a bond with each other. Initially, they were just scavengers of leftover food. Over time, they eventually became human pets. This relationship between wolves and humans will change the behavior and genetics of the wolves themselves, eventually giving rise to the proto-dog, making it the first animal domesticated by humans. It has been proven that domestic dogs originated from prehistoric wolves that lived in the Pleistocene, and today, dogs have a close relative, namely the modern gray wolf, where the two have up to 98% DNA similarity. They have the same ancestor, and the two separated around 20,000 to 40,000 years ago. Even the domestic dog was classified as a subspecies of the gray wolf, or Canis lupus, to Canis lupus familiaris, or another name for dog. Humans and dogs have evolved together, so how have dogs become so diverse now? As explained by scientists who say that organisms can only be said to be domestic when their genetics have been changed permanently through breeding with human intervention. At first, of course, these dogs still looked like wolves, and then over time they diverged from wolves at a time known as with the agricultural revolution starting about 12,000 years ago. Dogs have had a form of adaptation. Described in research published in 2016, it shows that dogs have more copies of the AMY2B gene, which is the code for an enzyme that functions to break down starch, meaning it is possible that dogs have been able to digest rice and wheat. This is different from their wolf ancestors, which were more carnivores. And this is also very closely related to human diet in the era of the agricultural revolution, where humans who initially hunted and gathered food finally started planting and cultivating their own food, including wheat and rice, meaning that dogs have adapted to following the human diet. Humans and dogs have been friends for thousands of years. Even ancient people have shown emotional ties to dogs. There is a lot of archaeological evidence in ancient tombs from the late Pleistocene to the mid-Holocene that shows dogs buried close to humans. For example, the tombs in 14,000-year-old Germany where two people were buried with a dog. In the Middle East, a 12,000-year-old tomb shows a woman buried with a puppy. But why do dogs have such close bonds with humans? In a recent study, it has revealed the influence of oxytocin in forming good relationships between dogs and humans. Oxytocin itself is a hormone that also plays a role in human social bonds, including mother and baby bonds, where dogs and humans release oxytocin when spending time together. Dogs are able to differentiate between positive and negative human facial expressions and will react accordingly. However, not everyone considers dogs to be friends. In some places or cultures, the opposite is true. Since living side by side with humans, humans have brought dogs to various parts of the world. Dogs are slowly experiencing changes from wolves. These differences arise due to environmental factors and a method used by humans, which is called selective breeding. This is a way of mating or breeding plants and animals with the aim of producing certain genetic characteristics. The easiest example to understand this mechanism is that we can see it in livestock such as chickens and cows. Chickens were developed to produce eggs and partly to produce meat. The same goes for cows. Some were developed to produce milk and some to produce meat. They are actually the same species, but through selective breeding, they ultimately produce certain traits. Selective breeding of dogs has been carried out by humans to produce characteristics such as hunters, guard, and herding dogs. And increasingly, dogs have been developed with more diverse functions. Selective breeding has also given rise to various differences in physical characteristics. Dogs are domestic animals that have a lot of diversity. Currently, there are around 300 to 400 recognized dog breeds throughout the world. But it turns out that most of these actually existed. Not long ago, they came from the Victorian era, which was only about 200 years ago, where in that era dog shows became a very popular phenomenon and encouraged humans to breed various dog breeds. It was in that era that the majority of the dog breeds we see today began to be developed. But if domestic dogs descended from wolves, then what about wild dog species? Do they have a relationship? In Indonesia, we know the Ajag dog and the Papuan singing dog, which are dogs that live in the wild. For the Ajag dog, they are a separate species, which are native dogs from the archipelago and are not the same as wolves. In fact, the genus is different from wolves and domestic dogs, which come from the genus Canis, while the Ajag dog comes from the genus Coon. When compared to Ajag dogs, domestic dogs are more closely related to wolves. Meanwhile, in Indonesia, there is also something called a mongrel dog. Although both are reddish-brown in color, mongrel dogs and Ajag dogs are not the same species. Mongrel dogs are an imported domestic species from other regions. Ajag dogs are one of Indonesia's biodiversity that must be protected, because unfortunately they are now categorized as endangered. In Africa, there are also wild dogs that are quite well known, and they are also a separate species, so they are also different from wolves and domestic dogs. Furthermore, in Indonesia, there are also singing dogs from Papua, so named because these dogs have a unique howl which is associated with singing. Currently, the classification of Papuan singing dogs is still being debated. Some experts consider them to be a domestic dog breed. Others consider them to be a species itself, namely Canis halstromi. Meanwhile, in 2005, mammalian expert Christopher Wozencraft classified the Papuan singing dog and the dingo from Australia as subspecies of Canis lupus, namely Canis lupus dingo. Yes, the Papuan singing dog and the dingo are close relatives, but the point is that their taxonomic status still needs to be reviewed further. As the first species to be domesticated, dogs have been close friends of humans for thousands or even tens of thousands of years. Even though their ancestors were the fearsome wolves, humans have selected them to become the dogs we know today, creating a social relationship between these two different species. That's the discussion about dog domestication. If you have anything to add, please write in the comments column. That's all for this video. Thank you.